where a person has shared a platform with someone who themselves has been expelled from the Labour Party because of their position on anti-Semitism, for opposing the necessary and essential action the Labour Party has taken under Keir Starmer to correct the shocking position we were in on anti-Semitism, that would preclude them from going forward as a Labour candidate.
We're going to be speaking later on to Jamie Driscoll, the Mayor of North Tyne. He has been left off the candidates list for the new Mayor of the North East. He does have a record as Mayor. Why is that?
Well, Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party, and he's changed it in many ways. But one of the processes that we now have in place is an extensive process of due diligence for candidacies that are coming forward. We haven't had that in the past. And I think, to be honest, that is why some people who have been elected as Labour representatives have fallen below the standard the public expect of them. To be very specific, where a person has shared a platform with someone who themselves has been expelled from the Labour Party because of their position on anti-Semitism, for opposing the necessary and essential action the Labour Party has taken under Keir Starmer to correct the shocking position we were in on anti-Semitism, that would preclude them from going forward as a Labour candidate unless they could have a good account of why that significant event has taken place. It isn't, to be honest, Adam, expedient at times to do that. It does cause a row. But when we have said we will have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, we meant it. And that means holding to that high standard in all circumstances, whoever it affects.
You are talking about Ken Loach, the distinguished film director who he shared a platform with. Ken Loach has been off and on a member of the Labour Party. As I say, he has a distinguished record as a film director. Are you seriously saying that no one in Labour who wants to hold office can be associated in any way with Ken Loach?
They would be asked what were the circumstances of the event they took place in. They'd be given a chance in that interview process to put forward the circumstances and reasons for that. But, we have had to deal with a group of people in the Labour Party who did not accept the legal findings of the AHRC, the investigation into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. We've given commitments as leaders, as Keir and Angela have done, and as a shadow cabinet and NAC, that we will deal with this. And it gives me absolutely no pleasure when we have to do so. I wish we didn't have to do so, to be honest. But when I've been on talking to you guys on this specific programme about promising that we will sort this out, that there will be no return in the Labour Party to the unacceptable position we found ourselves in the past, we meant it. And I'd rather be having this difficult conversation with you than a one where you come to me and say, look, you promised zero tolerance, but you haven't delivered on it. We are committed to a degree of public investment alongside other key policy levers around industrial strategy, planning reform, skills reform, and so forth. Because first of all, for us, net zero is primarily about the potential for a once-in-a-generation economic opportunity for the UK to secure good jobs in every part of the country. Now, that components of that 28 billion break down to specific projects for green steel, for gigafactories, and obviously on day one you wouldn't be able to hit the scale of that. But if you look, for instance, at the automotive sector in this country, we know if we aren't building batteries in the UK, we will not build cars in the long term. The cars will be built where the batteries are built. So even this government is committed to some degree of public subsidy for a battery factory, probably for Jaguar Land Rover, but they aren't transparent about that. They don't publish that. It's hard to know what the criteria is and what they will fund. So we're going to get a bad deal. I mean, I hope that goes ahead, but we're probably going to get a worse deal than we could have got by having an upfront, clear strategy about it. So it's about capital assets, we'll manage the public stakes and that, but fundamentally about good jobs in every part of the country. And that's from the energy system to the industry we have in the UK. We've got to make this big transition, but we know the costs of not doing so will definitely be greater.
Yeah, I mean, £28 billion a year in extra borrowing for green investment is a huge amount of money. Why is it 28 billion? Why not 30 or 10 billion pounds? I mean, what's the guarantee that the country's going to get value for money? Who's going to keep an eye on that? Is it Ed Miliband?
Sure. First of all, the figure that was given when the announcement was first made at a Labour Party conference a few years ago was basically based on the scale of investment required to leverage in the greater amount of private investment on a reasonable ratio to deliver the scale of change that we need. I mean, net zero has probably got, I would say, as a project, no peacetime comparison in British economic and political history. So it is a big project, but fundamentally it's about leveraging in that greater amount of private investment. We've seen in the Biden administration how successful they've been in a short space of time of operating a policy like this. And who tells us who's responsible for that? Well, of course, that is the whole of the incoming, hopefully, Labour government, particularly the Treasury, around making sure that's good value for money. We do want something back for this, I've got to say. When we are going to fund, for instance, with industry, the transition to green steel in the steel industry, we'll want to manage a stake in that project on behalf of the public. That's what our National Wealth Fund is going to do. Similar story with gigafactories. There are other things around retrofitting homes, which will reduce our energy consumption overall, be more energy secure, as well as giving people lower bills. So we'll want something back for this. But I say again, if we miss out on this economic opportunity, it will be, to be honest, one of the worst things the UK has ever experienced. And I do worry we're blowing it under this Conservative government, because we're not where we need to be on industrial decarbonisation, on home heating, on the kinds of opportunities that I would say the UK is uniquely placed to exploit.
But where are you going to get the 28 billion a year from?
Public investment will be borrowed money, because it's capital investment, it's not revenue spending. You will know when we cite higher revenue spending, whether that's on higher better mental health services or an NHS workforce, we hypothecate the changes and where that revenue would come from. So,
the national debt will go up then?
Well, we believe debt will fall over the course of a parliament. That is our fiscal rule.
Not if you're borrowing
and
another
crucially,
28 billion a year, it won't.
Well, but fundamentally, if you look at where we are at the minute, the UK has the lowest business investment in the G7. I would say that is the source of our poor productivity and our poor economic growth. And of course, debt can grow as a proportion of your GDP. If your GDP is not growing, and at 1.4%, the average since the Conservative Party came back to power, that is simply not sufficient, I would argue, to fund existing levels of public services, let alone the kind of public services people expect, because many of them are not working very well at the minute. So it's about growing the economy, and that will bring down the share of debt to GDP over time. But I honestly say we cannot afford not to do this. And if we wait simply to adapt to climate change, or we don't seek to get the good jobs that can come from adopting net zero, what a tragic waste that would be.
Speaking of things we can't afford not to do, what will be the economic impact on Britain of not going ahead and fully developing the opportunities in the North Sea and buying oil and gas from abroad instead?
Well, first of all, we are not for turning off the existing North Sea oil and gas fields. They will continue to produce right up until 2050. That is established. That is a fact. We are against
there are unexploited
new licenses
opportunities there, and there's going to be an economic cost to Britain of not going ahead with that, isn't there?
No, I would disagree with that. And the reason for that is, first of all, these are poor value for money. These fields would only go ahead with very substantial public subsidies. I mean, the Rosebank field is £3.75 billion of public subsidy in order, to go ahead. Alongside that, won't reduce bills, won't be better for energy security, because we have to buy, even though it's produced in the North Sea, oil and gas at the international market rate.
But Jonathan Reynolds,
that is why, even though we were exposed to a small amount of Russian gas and oil, we still had to be heavily affected by the crisis caused by the invasion of Ukraine, because we were so exposed to fossil fuels across the board. So I don't agree it's an economic loss to not proceed with them. I think that there are so many better alternatives. The real loss would come from not focusing on those as an alternative to that.
But what you've just said there, and I hope you've got a glass of water. Maybe you can take a sip of water. One of the things you've just said there is that exploring North Sea oil and gas won't go ahead without huge public subsidies. But you've said that just after you've announced £28 billion of extra borrowing to subsidise a whole new industry, which I'm sure lots of people would agree with you on. But actually, there are arguments to be made for exploring new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. It brings in jobs into that area. It means that we don't have to rely on other countries to bring in the oil and gas that we need. And by your own admission, the green industry, new renewable sources of power are not going to happen quickly, because you've got fiscal rules, which will probably mean you can't borrow £28 billion in the first, second, maybe even third year of a Labour government. So realistically, you will still need something to tide this country over. And it doesn't seem logical to lots of people to pay another country for oil and gas, which has its own carbon impact and a geopolitical one, when we could be exploring our own resources.
Let me take you through that step by step. So first of all, there's choices to make. Politics is often about choices, and if the choice is between fossil fuel exploration and exploitation or the industries of the future, I am firmly for the industries of the future. Second of all, in terms of the jobs impact, we have around about 28,000 people directly employed in the North Sea at the minute. Now, if those fields are going to continue till 2050, as they are, we're not going to be importing things to replace that. Those people are going to continue to work on those fields. But the amount of jobs available from net zero, clean energy in future is far in excess of those jobs that we have at the minute. And in terms of the pace of change, just look at the scale of private investment the Americans have generated in a small space of time since they passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Look at the UK even. We have one, I would say, very good story to tell in terms of the cost of offshore wind, some real problems around the supply chain and the jobs. The government could have done better on that. But in terms of the cost of that, the progress has been incredibly rapid. And just to be clear, I say again, there's some confusion sometimes over this. If we exploit resources in the North Sea, they're not sovereign to us. They don't come to us first at a preferential rate. They're exploited by companies in the usual way. They develop, and we buy it back at the international rate. So there's no benefit to us from having, in that sense, domestic production.
You cite the Americans. Fact of the matter is, yes, they have this massive IRA proposal to invest in green technology. They also happen to be the world's biggest oil and gas producers, and they're not switching things off, are they? Which is what you're proposing.
We're not proposing switching things off, Adam. We're not proposing switching things off. We are about the future, saying if the choice is between developing further oil and gas in the North Sea or going for the industry of the future in renewables, in hydrogen, in nuclear, and making sure we've got gigafactories and green steel, we're for the future because that's the economic opportunity. And just look at the scale of transition around the world. The International Energy Association, this is what they recommend. It is a climate disaster if every country exploits its own fossil fuels. Will not limit global warming to the scale agreed at the Paris Agreement. It would go far in excess of that. But most of all, it's about the jobs and the opportunity that comes with that. And when exploiting further resources in the North Sea won't reduce bills, won't give better energy security, costs a lot of money, isn't good for climate, and frankly, there are better alternatives available, I think the case is quite compelling.
Jonathan Reynolds, I want to, just before we let you go, ask you about a report in the Sunday Telegraph today that a Labour councillor in Greater Manchester has been elected the deputy mayor despite being under investigation over allegations of harassment of a young woman. Is that acceptable?
I'm not aware of that story, so I don't know which part of Greater Manchester that applies to, but I believe we have tried very hard in the Labour Party, first of all, to take swift action when allegations are made about anybody in terms of suspending them while an investigation takes place. And of course, we've overhauled the actual process of investigation extremely extensively. We've tried to remove any political considerations from that, absolutely make sure we're doing everything we can. There's always more to do, Kate, and I'm going to look into, now you've mentioned it, the circumstances of this story, see what I can find out. It may be confidential, and that's why I don't know about it. But fundamentally, we recognise across a whole range of areas, whether it's sexual harassment or dealing with anti-Semitism, the Labour Party needed to change and improve its processes, and we have genuinely tried to do that. And I think we act swiftly where allegations are made.
Yeah.
And to be honest, we don't see that sometimes in other political parties.
I think the concern about this story for some people will be that Rochdale Borough Council, which is where this is taking place, have confirmed that there is an investigation underway into this particular councillor who was voted uncontested by the local Labour group. The Sunday Telegraph is reporting that there are also two sources of separate allegations of sexual harassment against another councillor, which is being investigated by the Greater Manchester Police. Now, there are allegations in this article, which is in that newspaper today, that the investigation was kicked back, and I'm quoting this, because of the election, because the leadership didn't want anything to come out during that process. This is the Labour Party in Greater Manchester reportedly allowing somebody who is under investigation by the police to represent them. That doesn't seem like the party really has got a grip with this kind of problem.
Well, usually, Kate, the procedure would be where an allegation is made against someone, they would be administratively suspended, and that would preclude them from holding any kind of specific additional office, either that was political or a ceremonial one. So I will obviously try and find out the circumstances that are involved here, but that is the process I would usually expect to find it. And then, as I say, we've changed very significantly how we investigate complaints, how we support people in that process, and the factors that will ultimately weigh up the decision that is taken in that case. There has been a lot to do. I understand there's always more to do to make it as it should be, but we have genuinely significantly improved how we deal with these complaints. And wherever there is a specific example of it not working as it should, we will investigate that thoroughly.